Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look at a specific car, of course, from the Gran Turismo Sports Day 1 roster. And you might be thinking, wait a second, surely we've reviewed this car before. You might even have memories of that happening. Well, for me, I wasn't sure myself. I did have to double check on the channel because we have discussed the 4C in a very incidental way multiple times, because it has featured in different forms in quite a few videos on the channel. One of the earliest ones, of course, was my N200 circuit tune for this car. Of course, we relatively recently put it up against the new Alpine from that update pack, and of course we've done rally builds for the Group 3 road car. We also reviewed that car, we reviewed the racing version. There are a couple of videos that we haven't done, like the Group 4 race car, and also of course this one. Now it's taken a while to get around to doing it, but it's certainly a car that is, it goes without saying, worth reviewing, because just like the Citroen DS3 from yesterday, it's the kind of car which, when you first play the game, if you've been on previous Gran Turismo games at least, you'll probably be very happy to see. It's these kind of newer vehicles to the game that tend to be the most interesting, at least for me, and I know I can only speak for myself there, but I should think a lot of you guys as well like to go into a new racing game and look at the car list, see what's involved, what's new, what's unique, and this, for Gran Turismo, was certainly one of those. Now, fundamentally speaking, I have issues with cars like the 4C. I would also categorise the KTM Crossbow under a similar category, and that is real cars, of course, but cars which actually not only are expensive in the game, but are really expensive in the real world as well, and both the Alfa Romeo and the KTM are perfect examples of that. Not to say that they're bad cars, they're just stupidly expensive for what they actually are. Cars which have roughly the power of your average hot hatch, they even weigh as much as your average hot hatch, arguably, and the performance, although good, I would personally not say justifies a price which in some cases is similar to Porsche or Maserati money. Maybe that's just me, and of course they do have their advantages and people do buy them. Now in the case of this one, I would say that this car is a little bit more useful in terms of its lower end range than the KTM Crossbow or something like that, but of course the KTM is currently the best money earner in the game, so that's pretty difficult value to beat. However, this Alfa Romeo is really good for N200 circuit racing, which is of course why I did the tune for it. Now what you get from this car is a 1.7 litre engine. It puts out 235 horsepower, so as I said, kind of hot hatch territory in terms of capacity and power. The torque is actually really good, 257 pound-feet stock. It's relatively rare for a sports car to have more torque than power. This one does. That's an interesting choice from Alfa Romeo, and the weight is thankfully low. It's not just one of those cars that looks light, but actually isn't. Again, kind of like that Citroen DS3 from yesterday, if you compare it to this one, it kind of highlights the point that I was making. That car weighs 1165 kilos, this weighs 950. So, kind of a shame that modern hot hatches are getting heavier, when this car goes to show that you can still make a modern car with modern advantages lighter. Now, of course, the comparison is not fully equal. One's a 2-seater, one's a 5, etc, but you know what I mean. Now, the horsepower per tonne is pretty good, just under 250, so with a limited amount of power to begin with, it's not going to be astronomical. So the question arises, what's the car like if you haven't actually bought it yet? Well, there's no sidestepping the price is high. It's a 90 grand car. That's more, if I recall correctly, than the Nissan GTR, or at least a very similar kind of price. That isn't necessarily a good sales pitch for a car like this, because the Nissan is one of the best value cars you can get in a game, in the real world, so comparing anything to that, it's not going to sound great. But it does again go to highlight what I said, that this is a very expensive car for what it actually is, which is, if you're honest about it, a Lotus Elise or Vauxhall VX220 level machine. It has a little bit more power than they do, but it also weighs more, which kind of cancels that out. It's a great rival to those cars, but it's like 3 times the price. In the game though, money is far more easy to come by, of course, than in the real world, at least for most of us, so getting 90 grand probably won't bother too many people. So when you actually buy the car, what you get is different to its main rival, which I would arguably say is the new Alpine, in that this one is a little bit more slippery. The Alpine is a bit more forgiving, you could say, a bit more beginner friendly, whereas this one feels kind of like a mini super sports exotic, almost like a shrunken version of the Alfa Romeo 8C, but mid-engine instead of front. And for exotic feel, it certainly does offer that. It looks good, it sounds pretty good. The handling is not necessarily forgiving, as I said, but it is good in an abstract way. It's not easy for beginners, but it's very rewarding. So in a funny kind of way, it's actually like a Renault Clio V6. It's not the easiest of hatchbacks to drive, but it is a very competitive one. Likewise with this car, if you master it, the ultra-compact size, of course the low weight, they really do come in handy. Now the handling when you first get into the car, or even if you tune it actually, is quite reminiscent of something like an old school Grand Prix car, where it kind of weaves around on the road a little bit, and you can allow that to your advantage, funnily enough, kind of float through corners. Now the disadvantage is that the car doesn't necessarily like rash corrections mid-corner. If you do that, prepare to give it some counter steer, because you will get the tail out, and sometimes the ultra short wheelbase will make the car a little bit skittish under drifting circumstances, in a similar way to something like a Chaparral 2J. If you, for instance, remove the suction fan from that car, it would have very unpredictable handling because of its super short wheelbase, especially in comparison to how wide it is, just like this car. Now overall, this is a great car for N200, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, there are relatively few cars in the game, especially modern ones, that can match this one's ability at that level. The Alpine can, some hatchbacks can, but generally this is kind of an easy way to beat hatchbacks at the N200 level, and of course you can tune it up as well if you want to. This one in the video, for instance, it's doing around 180 miles per hour, and that's from 370 horsepower, fully tuned. So it's certainly got potential in N300. I think that might be classified as N400 with this level of power, but regardless, it goes to show what it is capable of. It's not quite as dominant as something like the KTM, of course, but in its own way, it's certainly a good little sports car, just one which in the real world I think is kind of encumbered by its own ridiculous price tag. But overall, definitely worth a look if by some weird coincidence or dark magic you haven't checked it out already. What are you doing? You must be new to the game then, but if you haven't for whatever reason, definitely check it out. I would say actually that this car is one of the most interesting and certainly one of the most useful new cars that have been added to the game, well, from day one. But that's it for this pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.